Alright guys, so you know my spiel by now. I love survival horror, it's a shame it no longer exists, blah blah blah. Listen, even I'm tired of saying it at this point. But luckily for both of our sakes, a game developer has entered the ring with a possible solution. Why not just bring survival horror back? A genius concept that's been tried many times but has never quite seen any real success. So can an uppity little Italian indie dev do the impossible? Could they create a game that finally brings me back to the combination of sheer terror and absolute satisfaction I felt when playing these classic survival horror games in my youth? Well, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.
Son of a bitch. How is this possible?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Like I said before, Daymare 1998 is a game looking to draw and improve on the survival horror classics from our childhood. A seemingly impossible task if you ask me, but if there's one way to do it right, a good story is going to be one of the most important factors. And without giving away too much from the very start, this game both gets it right and wrong at the same time. And trust me, we will most certainly unpack that nonsensical statement later, but first we gotta cover the easy stuff. Daymare takes place in 1998, a fact that it is more than happy to beat you over the head with. And right from the start, fans of Resident Evil will be pleased to hear this tale deals with secret experiments being conducted by a shadowy company looking to militarize a sort of kind of super soldier serum. The only side effect being, and this is such a minute little thing, it's not even worth mentioning, zombies. The events of the game have you starting off with a mission to recover this compound from a research lab that has recently come down with a nasty case of the mutated dead, and at this point you play as Liev, a tough-as-nails merc with no issues following orders, especially the kind that has him dealing with loose ends.
Oh, what the heck. I'll lend a hand.
Okay, so there's no beating around the bush here. We're pretty much playing the bad guy in this game, which makes for a pretty interesting setup. The idea of playing a character who's basically a stand-in for Resident Evil's Hunk is actually pretty cool and a nice little change of pace. But later we take on the additional roles of Samuel, a forest ranger, and Raven, one of the helicopter pilots from Liev's team. And thanks to some events I'm not going to spoil here, they both have to make it out of a small mountain town infested with dead bodies on a very strict living person diet. So right from the start, Daymare is awarded 0 points for originality. As anyone might have noticed, this is just a shot-for-shot recreation of RE's 1, 2, and 3. But to be completely fair, that is what I was looking for in this game. Sometimes a formula is so potent you can all but outright copy it and still have awesome results, which is exactly what I would describe the overall story here as. So why the negative words at the start of the section? Well, that is a much more complicated matter. One that I want to be very careful about. Like I said before, Invader Games is based out of Italy and, as you would expect, aren't the most fluent English speakers. So I know you're wondering why that should matter. Well, to be honest, if we're talking the general setup and overall story beats, it really doesn't. Daymare's story is relatively universal and does a really good job at building a convincing world. My only issue comes from the way that story is delivered to the player. You can pick any random section of the game containing dialogue, and right off the bat it will be very evident that neither the scriptwriter nor the voice actors used English as a primary language.
The Sacred Heart Hospital. He's going there, and then he'll be there.
This leads to some very awkward lines that are delivered in very odd ways. Now, this isn't exactly anyone's fault. I mean, I don't expect everyone in the world to speak my language, and as a little bit of an aside, I speak both bad Spanish and relatively beginner's level okay Japanese, so I know what it's like trying to express yourself in a foreign tongue. I'm not trying to criticize anyone here, but almost every interaction will likely have you getting drawn out of the moment as one of the characters delivers a really weird line, and you can't tell if their voice acting is to blame, if they were just working from a poor script, or some combination of the two. Like I said earlier though, Daymare does get by on its generally really good story, it's just the people telling the tale that causes a break in the chain. Aside from that, there are some good aspects to speak of, like the fact that Samuel has some kind of mental disorder that causes him to hallucinate, which makes for a really interesting experience. There's going to be times while you're playing when he'll see enemies that aren't there, and sometimes he's seeing reality, forcing you to always be on your toes when this happens. Another plus lies in the story structure itself. 3 separate times I could have sworn I was near the end of the game, but instead I would just take control of one of the other characters. This kept me interested and made sure I didn't get tired of any one scenario for too long. But getting back to the not so good stuff, one downside that had me scratching my head was an early game backstab that takes place on the helicopter when heading back to HQ. Now, I went back and watched the scene in question several times, and for the life of me I still have no idea why it went down. The only 2 conclusions I was able to come up with either had everyone acting very much out of character or was setting up a reveal that never really came. All things considered, I found myself getting into the general surface level story here, but was very turned off by the poorly written and acted personal drama involving the characters. If you ask me, this would have better served as a tale of desperate escape and not the crisscross of individual stories it is. So obviously there are some ups and downs to consider here, and I really do enjoy the story in a very broad strokes kind of way, but if you ask me, it's really hard to fully immerse yourself into a tale when this guy's telling it.
You throw your hands pretty fast, Major. I'll give you that. But tell me this. Can you throw your hands faster than a bullet?
Right from the beginning, Daymare has sold itself as a survival horror game for fans that enjoyed the genre's high point, aka the late 90s. The buzz that surrounded Daymare was always about that old style of survival horror returning to the modern gaming landscape, and I'm sure longtime viewers of the channel saw this coming a mile away, but that is definitely not what Daymare has done. Now don't take that as a negative, there are plenty of things this game gets right, and it does indeed borrow a lot of its design docs from the old PS1 games I love so much, but it's all encased in a modern third-person shooter exterior. Which again is not a bad thing, it's just not a survival horror thing either. And trust me, we will get into that later, but first we should probably lay a little groundwork. To sum things up pretty simply, Daymare uses the modern RE perspective and control scheme while looking to the original games in the series for its overall design and layout. And if I do say so myself, it has come up with some ingenious ways to improve on the tense, challenging gameplay common to the genre. On the surface, the game controls a lot like the RE2 remake, with simultaneous aiming and directional movement, with the addition of an all-out run to your typical walk-sprint dichotomy. After being dropped into an area, sometimes quite literally, the goal is to explore it, find ammo, avoid or kill the Pollux-infested monsters, and solve the puzzles standing in between you and progress. Now here I would typically make a few more sweeping statements to describe everything, but it's pretty hard to give a general summary on things like puzzles or environmental design because Daymare swaps between a number of design elements as the game goes on. So let's cover these changes in a more linear fashion than I usually do. First off, the game has you taking control of Liev with the goal of retrieving a sample from an infected research facility, and here the atmosphere is thick and palpable, just the way I like it. If you ask me, this starting point is both representative of what you can expect going forward, and, well, not. The small research lab does include some interesting puzzles, and ones that even had me stumped for a pretty good amount of time, but a very noticeable lack of backtracking comes with them. I mean, the layout of the lab was just screaming for it, but you end up progressing through the place, finding one locked door on your route, and the puzzle or item that will open that door is always at the furthest point you can progress to. This means trekking back in a straight line to one locked door. This exact formula repeats itself 3 times, and then after an airlift, we end up in the streets of Keensight, a small town that's been infected with a Pollux compound. Most of this area plays out in a linear fashion, with you ducking zombies in the streets while keeping an eye on the gauge in the corner that keeps you from spending too much time outside until you make it into a house. Wash, rinse, repeat another 3 times. Now don't get things twisted, I really like the look of this place. I mean, it plays into my very specific taste after all. My favorite part of RE2 has always been the beginning area. I love the idea of zigzagging around the Walking Dead who flooded the streets, but after the slow building and well done atmosphere in the lab, it felt weird to be forced into what was essentially a stressful action-oriented section. The beauty of both RE2 and 3's openings is that they start you off with a high level of stress and then ease you into a false sense of safety with the eerily quiet RPD or Raccoon City streets respectively. But I guess if you're not a fan of that style and you just struggled through the first area in Daymare, you'd probably appreciate the bump of adrenaline the town segment delivers. Moving on from here, we take over Sam and essentially repeat the last area's gameplay, only this time with a slower start to set up the atmosphere, since Sam has no idea what's happened here. Now, typically this would be a great idea, start slow and build up to the coming horror. The only problem is, we as players have been playing this game for more than an hour or two at this point. We already know what's coming. Setting up a scary reveal for something we've already experienced is not very effective pacing. Now, if you want my very subjective opinion, the game probably should have started with Liev's initial raid on the lab with his high-tech mercenary gear, and after transitioned into Sam's part directly, where we could have dealt with the game's enemies by avoiding them until we get our first weapon. This would have not only eased us into the combat in a much safer learning environment, but also given us a taste for what we could have accomplished once we got to a further point in the game and were armed to the teeth. Anyway, Sam's linear progression continues, only this time with a puzzle in the way. Now, this was not the worst puzzle in the world, I actually had fun with it, but it did have multiple phases and it was just begging to be spread out through a medium-sized area. Instead, the solutions were all one room away from each other, and that was kind of disappointing. At the end of this section, we reach the local hospital where the game flips the whole table over and says, "Fuck it, you want classic survival horror? Well, here you go." And I could not have been happier. The hospital is relatively large, with lots of locked doors and barred paths just itching to be circumvented. There are several floors to explore, a plethora of zombies to be dodged, and you'll be backtracking a lot here. Honestly, this was the most enjoyable part of the game for me. Sure, the puzzles made way for your more typical item-based roadblocks, but man, was it cathartic finally being able to fall into that cozy survival horror headspace. Honestly, I feel like the game should have stuck to this style of design exclusively because it's the most memorable part I encountered. But all good things must come to an end, and eventually we take control of Raven, the other pilot of the chopper. At first I was frustrated as hell with having to return to the same linear sightseeing tour, but we do eventually get to see a part of town that requires us to do a very small amount of exploring, plus it's bookended by a puzzle that took me nearly 30 minutes to figure out. Now, this was definitely less enjoyable than the hospital, but it did remind me a lot of navigating Raccoon City in RE3, and if this little nod to the game is anything to be believed, this was definitely on purpose. From here, we take a relatively linear sewer route to a more open area, and while we do crisscross the map once, things never get as satisfying as they were in the hospital. And I have to say this again, I think the devs had their hearts in the right place here, but I think they also patched together aspects of survival horror games without fully understanding their purpose and maybe what order events should occur in. But my largest gripe of all comes from the level structure. Instead of giving us large areas to explore and procedurally map out like survival horror games do, we're left with several small sections of a map at a time. And to be honest, that's not a fully negative critique. It does mean that we are constantly making forward progress, and that's a good thing. But that's just not how the genre works. Okay, look, if I'm sounding a bit negative here, it's mostly coming from my own expectations and not so much from the game itself. I was sold the idea of survival horror returning, and sadly that's not the case here. But the aspects of the genre that are present are done very, very well. At first the combat had me pretty frustrated, but that was before I knew I had a melee option. After that, I found a pretty good system. One shot to the legs, some light pistol whipping, and a few rounds to the dome while they're recovering. This helped me save tons of ammo and healing items, and gave me the option of putting them down temporarily for situations when I wanted to avoid a fight. Something that made the game very fun to strategize in. Which was a pretty bittersweet reward when I realized if there were more instances of backtracking, this could have been even more satisfying. But there's one thing that Daymare gets absolutely right, and in my opinion that's the difficulty. On the recommended Daymare mode, I was dying a lot, and I know that doesn't sound like high praise, but it most definitely is. It seems like the game's approach to combat is, if you weren't prepared for it ahead of time, you don't deserve to make it out alive. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of prep work that goes into making sure your hypothalamus gland stays inside your body. For example, there are healing items that can be used outside of the inventory screen, but there are also some that can't be. And once you've used a healing item, it doesn't just instantly restore health. You've got to wait for it to gradually heal you, making for a nice amount of tension in fights. Also, outside of the inventory, ammo's got to be reloaded on a per magazine basis, meaning if you run out of rounds in a mag, you have to go back into the inventory to reload it. This means keeping a lot of magazines in your inventory, which isn't always ideal, or running away finding a safe spot and reloading. And the icing on top of this crazy cake is that the inventory screen does not pause gameplay, so get used to either doing all of this beforehand or getting really good at navigating this very clunky menu on the fly. Oh, and don't you worry, we are not done yet. Under a stressful situation, you can just hit the reload button and drop your current magazine on the ground, but that means you don't have that magazine anymore, you have to run and pick it up. While holding the button, make sure you hold on to the spent clip at the cost of a much slower animation. This is a pretty ingenious system and adds a lot of options to the combat. To be honest, I'd love to see this kind of mechanic make it into more games. That being said, I do also have a few issues regarding the combat. Issues I could probably just classify as general jankiness, but I want to be very specific for one very important reason. I think these are all things the team might be able to fix. And first on that list are the very odd animations. Now on the surface, enemies animate pretty fluidly, but you'll notice they don't have any transitional animations, for lack of a better word. And what I mean by that is, a zombie will seemingly teleport from a standing wobble to a lunge attack, or from their stun cycle to grabbing a hold of you. And I know that sounds like a visual complaint, but a large portion of the game's combat is based on knowing when and when not to get near a zombie, and this can be kind of hard to do if you can't read their movements properly. Compounding the matter is their grab range seems much wider than it should be. I know what you're thinking, and yes, you're probably right, I should just adapt to how the game plays, but I couldn't help but feel like it's much bigger than it looks. Next up is the inventory screen, and like I said before, this thing is very unintuitive. But the real issue is a lack of mouse support. I will admit it's much easier just using a controller, but with a keyboard and mouse, this thing becomes a nightmare. Lastly, there is a crazy amount of lag between performing certain actions and being able to perform another. Like, I understand I shouldn't be able to change weapons and be aiming down sights before my character has his gun out, but it looks like they need to perform the animation of switching weapons, let their hands drop to their side, and there are still several frames after this where you can't aim, reload, or melee. This makes it incredibly hard to swap weapons on the fly and to time out specific actions. The same thing goes for trying to interact with things while you're running, it just doesn't happen. I think a few tweaks here could make the game much less frustrating. Oh, and maybe lessen the amount of time a zombie is invincible to melee hits while they're getting up. There's no real way to gauge when you should hit them again, and being close enough for a melee hit means you're close enough for them to latch onto you. Now, I know that was a lot of negativity, but I want to say I really enjoyed this game. It sets up such a nice atmosphere, and the improvements they've made to the survival horror playstyle are nothing short of pure genius. I will admit I had to hold back a frustrated scream or two, but that was in between moments of pure terror and excitement. So no, it's not a traditional survival horror game, at least in my very stringent standards, but it's a pretty incredible hybrid and actually improves on old genre tropes that I thought were perfect just the way they were. Hopefully some of the issues I have will end up being patched out of the game after this video goes live, and I imagine at that time it'll be a much smoother experience for it. But as it is now, I can say it is a very fun, very challenging love letter to the games I fell in love with as a teen. If you're in the mood for an incredibly innovative time and willing to overlook some pretty annoying flaws, Daymare could prove to be a nice stopgap until Capcom gives us another RE game.
Why? Why do you want to access the server? I thought you were actually here to rescue us.
Technically, those were your words, not mine. Sorry, bud. Orders are orders.
Okay, so after all the complaining, at least the game's presentation will be easy to sum up, right? Well, yeah, Daymare is a really good looking game. Most of the time. Yeah, sorry, we're doing this again. Right from the start, I was very impressed with what these guys did with their Unreal Engine license. The lighting is pretty good looking, except when your flashlight is reflecting off of shiny surfaces and hits you with the brightness of the sun. And textures look pretty damn convincing, except when you notice them visually popping in not too far from your eyes. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Yep, that's right. It seems like every legitimately good-looking element in this game has an inversely bad-looking aspect to it. Now, I struggled with this issue while writing this part of the video because I honestly do have a lot of good things to say about the game's look, but depending on how long I thought about those things, I always ended up with a negative counterpoint. And to be honest, it took me a while to really wrap my head around this problem, but then I remembered the game's animations and it hit me. Daymare really does have an overall great looking design and execution, but the small elements that link the graphics together as a whole are where my issues lie. To go back to the animations, they look great, but the characters and enemies snap in and out of them unnaturally. Shooting your weapons is very satisfying and impactful, but blood splatter that comes from scoring a hit seems distractingly low budget. Now it has to be said, this was not a AAA dev team with millions of dollars to spend. Even with my complaints, it's clear these guys put their hearts into this, and I don't want to diminish that, but I think the game's overall good-looking graphics caused the rift here. And I know that sounds absolutely insane, but look at this. Walking through this area right here, you could be forgiven for thinking this game had a much larger budget. And for me, it's this high level of fidelity where the problem lies, as it makes the less well-done aspects of the presentation stick out like a sore thumb. It's the double-edged sword of fancy, well-made game engines. With typical indie games, you notice small moments of beauty peeking out from a less than good-looking game. But with Daymare, well, it's the opposite. And now that I've hit you with the meta weird stuff, I have to say my only real "you guys gotta fix this" kind of complaint comes from the pre-baked cutscenes. These cinematics look pretty okay, all things considered, minus Sam's terrible beard, but they all seem to play at a very choppy frame rate. My PC was telling me it was delivering a solid 60 frames per second, so I assumed they were just recorded this way, or maybe there's a problem with their playback. I'm not sure, but either way it was pretty annoying. To end on a good note, I have to give it up to the game's environment designer. Every area from its secret labs to its mountain passes and your average small town home look very convincing, and the attention to environmental lighting is pure perfection. My favorite areas were the zombie-ridden streets of the town, but the gameplay in these parts made sure I couldn't stick around long enough to really check things out. Facial animations for your characters are pretty bad all around, but zombies all move their mouths realistically, so that's a plus. And while we're on the subject, I really love the variety of zombies to be found here. There seems to be more than 20 different types of zombie models, and the clothes they're wearing always reflect the area you find them in, which is always something I like to see. Sadly, that's countered by the bigger, more powerful enemies all looking kind of dumb to me, but you fight them much less than the regular guys, so it's not really an issue. One thing I really appreciated were all of the movie, book, and game references to be found. These little flourishes reminded me of playing old PC games and seeing these inside jokes all over. And with all of those ups and downs, I want to make sure I'm clear here. Daymare is a really impressive looking game given the circumstances. It's only a few features shy of a very AAA look, but the tiny connecting fibers aren't quite as impressive as the surface level stuff, which can become pretty evident. If you come into this game with proper expectations, you'll likely be relatively impressed. But sadly, these guys made the game look so good that you're gonna notice when it acts up, which I guess could work as either a compliment or a criticism. Okay, so as usual, I would recommend you draw your own conclusions here. I am well aware that I tend to notice things most people don't bother with. I've made peace with that fact. If you want my take, I'd say Daymare does a great job of bringing back a very old style of gameplay, and while it doesn't quite reach the title of survival horror, it gets much closer than most games do. Now sure, there's going to be a lot of hiccups along the way, but that's kind of the territory that comes with playing games like this. When you ditch the soullessness of the AAA games market, you're able to create games with honest-to-goodness heart at them, and that's exactly what we have here. A game made by survival horror fans for survival horror fans. If you're looking for a challenging and refreshing attempt at the genre, I'd say look no further. I honestly had a blast with this one once I shed my modern gaming habits and started playing it like it was meant to be played. And I really did get flashbacks to the late 90s, so I'd say that's a mission accomplished. Of course, if you're like me and quick to notice any kind of flaws or shortcomings that come with indie game development, expect an existential panic attack here. And I think that's about enough jump scares for me, but I will be back soon, so as usual, I'm Jared. And this is Avalanche Reviews. Hello, you amazing, sweet, beautiful creatures. Thank you for sitting through this bad boy. I know it wasn't the shortest video in the world, but I genuinely did have a lot to say. If you like horror games like this, I have more videos linked here, along with my Patreon. So if you get into fully independent YouTube game reviews, maybe think about throwing some support my way. But regardless of what you decide, I hope you have a killer day, and I will see all of you next time.